Hi everyone, Lynn here from Levels Out Associates. Welcome to this Emotion Focused School Support webinar. So this is a 2-day training condensed into two 30-minute presentations. So if you feel like you're not getting everything that you need, my goal here today is to give you just enough of the skill to be able to use it. Please keep in mind that this presentation was originally prepared by Dr. Adele Lafrance, a wonderful human being, and I will add the link to her website down below, but I have modified it for current situation and population. So what I hope you get out of this session is to understand why use emotion-focused school support, how it came to be, hoping teachers can begin to understand how emotions impact thinking. I'm really hoping teachers can become aware of how emotion avoidance in our society has an impact on how we react and on ourselves. And I hope to leave you with a few tools to allow teachers, educational assistants, and other individuals within the school board to practice emotion coaching with children and with parents, and actually anybody who has a strong emotion. Emotion-focused school support was developed to meet a variety of needs, and Dr. Lafrance first developed EFFT with Joanne Dolhanty, but saw that with some modifications, it could meet the issues presented to her by teachers and police officers for that matter. But if we look at teachers specifically, they were reporting that they had learned a lot about behavioral and classroom management techniques, and that these worked in general for most of the kids, but those kids who had bigger, stronger emotions, the ones with a more challenging history, didn't respond very well. Second, teachers often felt that their classrooms were under control for the most part, but they had received little training in dealing with parents' behavior. And these interactions were the ones that would tend to keep them up at night and make them feel burnt out, more so than the interactions with the kids. So the stresses that teachers experienced could lead to reactions in themselves that they found problematic. And what I feel is greater knowledge of emotion basics really helps reduce these reactions. Of course, given the reality, it has to be brief and not require a lot of training or background in mental health. Teachers are not mental health professionals, and this model really respects that by keeping it simple and helping teachers move past the emotion quickly. So why emotion coaching now? When I was asked to prepare a training for an agency that I work for, I chose this. Now, I'm acutely aware and very sensitive to the amount of work that has been occurring in teachers and with teachers over the past year. And that learning curve must have been just incredibly steep. And a lot of teachers have nothing left to give. But psychologists are calling for this pandemic to be seen as a long-term public health issue, not an event whose outcome is short-lived. It's predicted that once this crisis is over, emotions will run high, as they do following a crisis. So unfortunately, the types of parental interactions and big emotions on the part of students might be more common once the children come back in September. We need to develop strategies to help mitigate the impact on mental health and education, and by protecting our own mental health along the way. And I really believe that emotion coaching does just that. Because the science tells us that if we process emotions, they can be released. In releasing the emotions, we can move on and heal. If we don't process them, they fester, they become toxic. And so dealing with emotions when they're little is so much easier than dealing with them after some time has passed. Protecting our own mental health along the way comes as a byproduct of using this strategy and noticing our own emotions and needs early. And so whenever we process those emotions, everyone feels better. You're not a therapist, you're a teacher or an EA or a principal. This training is not meant to turn you into a therapist, but I believe I can teach you enough of the skill to have a huge impact. People can really underestimate how powerful they can be in a child's life. So if you think about the 1-degree effect on a flight, for example, let's say a flight from Toronto flying to Florida. If your flight path is off by just 1 degree and not corrected as it would be, you'd end up in a completely different place. So, although it seems minute, 1 degree can have a huge impact. Okay, so let's get to it. First of all, having emotions is part of being human. That's not going to change. But what is important to realize is when emotions are high, children, teenagers, teachers, parents cannot access reason or problem solve. When emotions are high, it literally blocks access to the capacity to learn. It blocks access to what you've already learned, and it blocks access to flexible thought. We lack cognitive flexibility, which is required for problem solving, but also to be able to work with a teacher to shift our own behavior. I'm going to show you a hand model of the brain that I believe comes from Daniel Siegel. So if you use your hand as a model for the brain, and the wrist and the wrist would be the brain stem, the thumb tucked away represents the limbic system. The fingers would be the cortex or the thinking part of the brain, with the front of the fingers representing the frontal lobe. So deep inside the brain structure is the limbic system, very specifically though the amygdala, which for all intent and purposes is the emotion center of the brain. When someone is highly aroused by emotion, there's a disconnect between the emotional part of the brain and the thinking part of the brain, so that the person cannot access that part of the brain. There's just no pathway when they're young, for sure. There's no road to reason. So if you're concerned about the lack of self-control, don't worry about it too much because self-regulation is built through co-regulation. And so you can help build that road. So as adults, we don't experience that feeling so much of being out of control. The only example I could think of was losing your child in a large and unfamiliar mall. You just can't think. And I mean, you may at the beginning be able to call their name a few times, but in no time at all, your amygdala is in overdrive. You are so scared that your brain is flooded and it does not work the way it should. If you're lucky, someone from the outside comes and becomes your surrogate frontal lobe and asks you what they look like, tells you to relax. But outside of that type of reality, this doesn't happen to adults very much. But that's what's happening in the overly emotional child's brain, and why a student having strong emotions cannot access their logic. So if you use the hand model for the brain, I would think that expression, flip your lid, might come from that, when the cortex is no longer accessible. This is particularly problematic for superfeelers. So superfeelers is not a diagnostic term. It's a term that was developed through emotion-focused family therapy to capture that child who experiences emotions very deeply. So you all know those kids who are maybe having a meltdown because they can't find the right Lego, whereas other kids wouldn't have that big of an emotional reaction. When they feel sad, they feel extremely sad, very deeply sad. And when they're mad, they're really angry. A superfeeler doesn't only experience their emotions on high, they experience the feelings of others very strongly as well. That's a child who might go home saying, the teacher yelled in class today. And you're shocked to hear this because you might have been irritated that day, but you felt like you really did a good job of hiding that from your students. And you surely, like in your opinion, didn't yell. A superfeeler feels small shifts in behavior that signal emotions. If a superfeeler comes to you and asks, are you angry? And you're a little bit irritated, not even at them, but you say no, and just like an aside, irritated is baby angry, so keep that in mind for later. But if you deny what they sense and they're a superfeeler, that will cause them to feel more stress because they can sense there's something wrong, and what they're sensing is not lining up with what you're saying, which is stressful. Don't think it's on the slides, but just keep in mind when the internal environment is mirrored in the external environment, that is a very soothing impact on a human being. So by all means, I won't. You won't go around telling all of your kids these problems, but you have to be aware that these kids can experience other people's emotions quite acutely, which can be overwhelming, especially if they are at a young age and their frontal lobe, or that part of the brain that helps them manage emotions, isn't quite developed yet. So not are only are they contending with their emotions, they're contending with the emotions of those around them. Some of you will also know those kids who try to manage other people's behavior. They try to manage other people's emotions and reactions. Part of the reason is that because they are sometimes flooded by the experience of their own emotion and others' emotions, they try to manage their environment. The other piece about super feelers is that teenagers who would be considered super feelers have a particular sensitivity to perceived threat and dominance. Now, that can be really problematic in a school setting where there are clear dominant people. So there's a teacher, teacher's aide, principal, vice principal, secretaries. So super feelers can react quite strongly to anything they perceive to be threat like or dominant like. And they can react in two ways. They can either retreat in fear, or they can react by getting bigger. So basically, the fight or flight you might see. Being a super feeler can be super distressing because I mean, there's a lot going on in the brain, and the child likely doesn't have many internal strategies to be able to cope with it. So that's when you have kids escalating quite quickly and really needing the environment to help them manage those emotions. Kind of like that person in the mall who came to help you calm down when you lost your child. Thankfully, though, thanks to the maturational process, every year it should get better, especially if they have someone modeling this for them. So, as the brain develops, that child is going to be better able to manage those emotions. But it's always good for people just to know about this concept because it can help you make sense of those things that don't make any sense at all in your classroom, which you might find to yourself very frustrating. Um, that this child is having this particular reaction in this non just nonsensical situation. So have your eyes open for super feelers. Um, but with regards, however, to learning in general, sadness, shame, and frustration are likely present in most of the kids. The emotion of frustration is part of learning. Frustration is baby angry as well, baby anger. So it has energy and strength. It's like, ugh. When someone struggles to reach their goal, it can cause frustration, and that's normal. I'm willing to bet actually that if not one, all of the teachers have experienced frustration this year as they learned various platforms, new teaching strategies, learning how to deal with parents and these requirements. Some of our kids, however, don't have the skills to be able to cope with that level of frustration. This is especially true for kids in the below average range, who will need more modeling and support to develop their coping skills for frustration. Sadness and shame are also part of learning. Sadness has a heaviness to it and a low energy, and it calls for comfort. Sadness might present if a child didn't achieve what he had hoped to achieve, or if other kids had better grades than he did or she did, or if they have strong emotions about missing other activities because they have a learning disability and so they have more homework than other kids. Whereas shame might come in a variety of forms, but here I'm talking about the shame of not living up to expectations or realizing that you have greater needs than some of your friends. When emotions are high, whether from frustration, sadness, or shame, access to reason, problem solving, and fund of knowledge is limited, if or at least obstructed, because the cognitive portion of the brain is not accessible to the child in the presence of the strong firing that's happening in the amygdala. So that was a section on how emotions impact thinking. So I want to move now to talking about emotion avoidance in our society. So what's your impulse to a child saying, I'm a loser, nobody likes me? There are many answers. And the important thing is to sit and feel that if you were in this situation where a child said this to you, what would your impulse be? So I'll just share mine, and hopefully you've had, if you need some time to think about it, just pause. But I know mine not even that long ago, before increasing my awareness of emotions, would have been, oh my gosh, no, no, you're not a loser. You're so sweet. Everybody loves you, or something like that. And when you look at that answer, it does not convey understanding to the child at all. In fact, I think it speaks to my discomfort with the emotion more than speaking to that person's emotion. It doesn't talk about emotion in the least. And in that sense, it's dismissive. So think about it. I'm not, I'm a loser. Nobody likes me. What's the emotion that you feel there? Sadness, rejection. So I'm not ill intended. It's my goal to help kids. So why would it be my tendency and likely your tendency to dismiss those feelings? One reason might be that we feel uncomfortable with other people's pain, and we think dismissing that feeling makes it go away. Another might be that their pain causes us pain. This is especially true if these are your own children or if you know the children very well, and that hurts. So not only are we avoiding their pain, we're avoiding our pain too. We might not know what to say. Maybe we see that the child is not accepted by the group and we don't want to make it worse. Or another issue might be that we don't agree or understand. Maybe that child is always hanging out with the most popular kids in class, so it doesn't make sense to you at all. But a big one is definitely that we were not taught how to respond to emotional pain, such as vulnerability and anger. But to be fair, neither were our parents and neither were their parents. And the stronger the presence of trauma, the more likely that emotion processing was difficult and therefore avoided. So the initial 2-day training offered by Dr. Lafrance was very experiential. And I want you to experience just a little bit of that. So I'd like to take you on a trip down memory lane in the spirit of experiential learning. Think of a time when you were maybe 12 years old. Try to remember what you looked like, who was your teacher, what was going on at that time in your life with your parents, with your friends. If you would, recall if you related to that feeling of being a loser. If you can, use that. Otherwise, do you recall saying something emotionally charged or something you would have liked to have vocalized to a parent and didn't for fear of how they would have responded? A stronger emotion you might have tried to express to a teacher or a parent at the time. So just try to remember that feeling and bring yourself into that feeling. Try to imagine you're telling a trusted adult how you feel in that moment. Now, hear the adult say the things that we responded to that first impulse. It's not a good time for that now. Of course not. That's not true. That doesn't make sense to me. Don't worry about things like that. It doesn't feel great. In fact, it's sometimes crushing. And what happens is a person is not prone to opening up again with that type of emotion if it was dismissed the first time. And what your parent or teacher responded may be true. It may be all true, but it doesn't heal. It doesn't even feel good. So, how did we get there? How did we learn to do this? Avoiding. Avoidance is, in fact, until really recently, encouraged. It's been in think positive, Hakuna Matata, don't worry, be happy. And in the past 10 years, I would say we're finally coming around to it's okay to not be okay. But that's not how we were conditioned. And why did this become the norm? Well, historically, in times of crisis, such as wars, any type of crisis, in fact, you tend to put emotions on the back burner. And during the crisis, you may not have time for emotions. So think about it. It doesn't make sense to attend to little Johnny's sadness about his difficulty with math or someone arguing with him when his brother's overseas being shot at. All the while, during this crisis, these mothers are more busy than ever with less support than ever, And these mothers didn't have time anymore for little Johnny's little baby feelings. So it's natural to push them to the back burner. You need to deal with the crisis at hand rather than the frills, so to speak. So mothers had little energy or tolerance for young, upset children. And they may have started telling them, like, suck it up or ignore it or just go play. The problem being, after the crisis was over, probably because emotions are not an obvious wound, such as a cut or broken bone, we didn't know that emotions needed to be processed in order to avoid problems. And the problem with not processing emotions is that as a society, we avoid them. And then as a result of this, of not knowing what they're about and what they're for, um, they fester. So you grow up not processing emotions and you teach your children to avoid emotions, and they teach their children to avoid emotions. So we know now that emotion avoidance, shoving emotions down and ignoring them, leads to mental health and addictions problems. And I honestly never thought I would live through a world event that fell into the category of a crisis. But here we are. This pandemic is a crisis. We have to worry about everything. Teachers are at the end of their rope. So, of course, emotions get put on the back burner, and that's okay. But when the crisis ends, I hope that having this knowledge and strategy will help prepare you for dealing with the backlog of emotions that people, parents, children, you are going to have. And in that way, teach children a new way to cope with and process emotions so they can move forward more quickly and have fewer ramifications from this crisis. So, why do we have emotions then, if not to avoid them? Emotions have helped us survive. Emotions have a label, a bodily felt sense, an underlying need, and an action tendency. They signal us in very important ways. Fear signals us by making our heart race, sending blood to our eyes, our ears, preparing us for action to meet the need for safety by giving us what our body needs to meet the action tendency of running, hiding, or fighting. So think of meeting up with a bear in the woods. Fear gives you the adrenaline you need to survive that. Sadness signals us by making us feel slow and sluggish, opening us up to meet the need for comfort through the action tendency of wanting hugs and closeness. And anger, not aggression, signals us by, again, making our heart race, giving us energy in our muscles, tension, signaling the need to feel heard and to set a boundary so that we have the strength to defend that boundary. Sad people, for example, don't defend boundaries. They don't have the energy for that. Unprocessed emotions can become toxic, like a poison, and they don't allow the human to thrive. When you hear the term processing the emotion, that's what we mean. Labeling the emotion, acknowledging it in our body, listening to what it's telling us with regard to our own needs, and then trying to get those needs filled. Given this, I believe every little bit of emotion coaching can help. Another analogy for what happens in the brain when someone has a strong emotional reaction is the elevator analogy. If emotion is like an elevator, the door to reason is on the ground floor. If a student's amygdala is rapid firing, I want you to imagine they're in an elevator. But if you force the doors open on the ground floor, they wouldn't be there. Depending on how activated they are, they would be on the 5th, 7th, 11th, 20th floor. And what you're saying to them on the ground floor, the best of your logic and reassurance, is falling into this chasm. They are not there to hear it. You need to quickly bring them down, bring that child's emotion elevator down to the main floor so that you can then engage in problem solving, logic, and reason. And the way you do that is through the skill of emotion coaching. The key outcomes of emotion coaching are that they avoid escalations, they de escalate. This helps the kids to regulate and then over time helps them to internalize that capacity to regulate. Children learn to manage their emotions through supportive experiences with the environment. That's how self regulation develops. So sometimes parents and teachers might say, like, he's 13 years old, he should be able to manage his emotions. Well, if he's a super feeler, he needs way more support from the environment in general in order to internalize those skills. Also, that part of the brain doesn't finish developing well into your 20s. And so, without that combination of environmental input and maturation, it's actually too much to ask. So, doing this emotion coaching in the classroom over and over again will actually increase the capacity of the classroom to be able to then use the skills for themselves. So, the takeaway home message for emotion coaching is the following: a regulated physiology is critical for learning, and emotion coaching serves as a bridge to get there. Okay, so the model was meant to be done quickly. So, let's look at the brief model. Again, I don't see, but this is definitely Dr. Lafrance's slide. Can't see the copyright there. Easy. Step 1, validate. Step 2, support. Let's go into a little bit more detail about that. Recognize the emotion and validate it. Step 1. Now, validation here is a very specific definition. People talk about the concept of validation a lot, and it can mean different things. So it's really important that we have a shared understanding of that definition. In this model, validation means conveying understanding of the child's or adolescent's emotional experience and proving to them you know it makes sense to you from their perspective. So prove that you get it. Step 2 involves support of the emotional need and support over the practical need. Sometimes step 2 isn't even actually necessary. So first we'll start with validate, and of course then we'll move on to the support. Okay, so the first situation I want to explore is that of a kindergartner that misses her parent. She says she's upset. You might say, I can imagine why you might feel upset, and then add in the emotion based on what you see. In this case, I might say sad. But pause and think about that 3-letter word that might be itching to come out of your mouth. I can imagine why you feel sad, but. But don't worry, we're going to have a lot of fun today. Or don't worry, you'll be able to see your mom soon. Okay, so that's not validating because it's moving away from the emotion. And validation means leaning into the emotion, even if you do it just for a brief moment. And so the basic rule for emotion coaching is moving from but to because. I can imagine why you feel sad because you really miss her. And it's hard to be away from her at school. And because you give a third option based on what you're seeing for that particular child. And some of you might think, oh my gosh, if I do that, the floodgates are going to open. But the problem is that not going into it actually is not going to resolve the emotion. And that is ultimately going to interfere with learning. Going into the emotion, though, will calm that fury inside. It will calm the power of the emotion, which will then make the child more available for learning and more easily redirected. Okay, let's practice. I'm not happy with my grade. The child got 90%. Or I hate math. It sucks. I suck at it. What's your first instinct? I have been on the receiving end of that first one forever. And my instinct is, that's amazing. That's a great mark. You know, a lot of people would really want that grade. You should really be happy with that mark. I've also been at the receiving end of the, I hate math. It sucks. And my instinct there is, no, you're not bad at math. You know, like what can you do to make it better? Maybe you're not listening. Maybe you need to change places in the classroom. Like you'll get it. You just need to work harder. So if you want reassurance and problem solving to have an effect, first, you have to open the vault for it to enter, and you open the vault through validation. So, of course, we ultimately want to offer the reassurance and the problem solving, but it's just not going to work if the emotional world of the child is not open to receive it. And so, So I'm so sad. I only got 90% on my test. We might say, I can imagine why you might feel sad. The but is transformed into, I can understand why you might feel sad or disappointed because you're the kind of kid who aims for 100% and you studied really hard for that test and you wanted to get it. And you really value that one of your strengths is doing well at school. And so it's really important for you. And when it doesn't happen, it makes you feel sad. When the external environment mirrors the internal environment, that is when the calming effect happens. Whether or not it's rational, it doesn't actually matter because what's happening is by speaking to the sadness and using three becauses, and Adele's research and neuroscience is showing that the three becauses is most effective. Then the child's brain regains its flexibility, regains its perspective, regains his or her knowledge that 90 is actually a fantastic mark. But if you lead with that, the child is actually isn't on the ground floor and they're not there to receive that. They may be way up on the 11th floor. And pry those main doors, elevators open all you want, they're not going to have it. Without the validation piece, you're more likely to get resistance, like you don't understand me, or frustration on the part of the child, and then disengagement because they feel you don't get it. But if you can do that because three times, you bring their emotion down so that when you say to them, you know what, I'm really proud of you. You did really well, and 90% is great. You know, their brain is there, and therefore they can hear it and understand it. So let me tell you, reassurance is the go-to when people come to us with emotional pain, right? That's just what we do. We've been conditioned to do that. And unfortunately, it only works if it's preceded by validation. So this is what we're talking about. I can understand why you feel sad, mad, afraid. I can imagine why you might feel any of these emotions because. All right. Let's do this one. I hate math. It sucks. So just let yourself feel in your body what happens when you imagine a child that you really care about comes to you and says, I hate math. It sucks. Like I can feel it in my body. I almost want to scream, stop thinking that, or reassure them. We want to resist that impulse to reassure or to invalidate their experience. We want to resist that impulse to problem solve or to tell them they're doing something wrong. So, like, did you study hard enough? Were you listening when I taught you? Instead, try. I can understand why you might hate math because math is hard and because you know that a lot of the kids in the class are working on harder problems than you. It doesn't feel good inside. So, I can imagine that every time you start doing this math activity, it feels really yucky. That's the best way to redirect a child to continue to engage in the math activity. And you know, I don't know if you feel it, but I feel it in my body. I don't want to go into that discomfort. I don't want to somehow join them in that pain or that anger for a couple reasons. One, I don't want them to think that I think they're terrible at math. I don't want them to think that at all. You know, they shouldn't continue to practice, that they think that they shouldn't continue to practice their math skills. And so luckily those are mind traps. That's not actually what happens when you validate. When we look at the neuroscience of emotion, as well as the brain's response to validation, receiving validation actually opens that person up. That child then wants to move forward and keep trying. I can tell you that a few sentences of validating the emotion could go a really, really long way. After you validate, the doors open for support, redirection, and learning. So, a few practical tips. Use tentative language based on sincerity. You may need to play whack-a-mole, which means that you get the one emotion right and they kind of like that. So they're coming back at it with another emotion to see what you're going to do. Or an emotional reaction that to what you've said. So just keep going. Validate the new emotion. You need to try to approach the nonverbals of the child for maximum efficiency. Similar tone, volume, for example. So if the child is whispering to you, I want my mom, you come at it with a whisper. Likely if the child is screaming, I want my mom, You're not going to scream back. You're not angry back at them, but you need to have some energy. Oh, yes. You're a little bit mad because you'd rather be at home and you love your mom and you want to be with her. And it feels not fair that you have to come to school. I get it. So, this is something that comes with practice. You'll be creating new pathways in your brain. So, be patient with that skill, but do try to come at it with the same tone and volume that the child presents with. And it works best if you take it on as a stance rather than a strategy. The idea is that you'll notice the emotion and reflect your understanding back to the child. If you use it as a strategy, it might not come off very sincerely. Just remember this: it's not what happens, it's what happens next. So it's not the angry or sad feeling or the fact that we feel slighted or hurt by someone. What happens next? Having someone understand your point of view and mirroring your reality, if just for a little bit, that makes the emotion melt away. So you may have felt uncomfortable with validation, resisting leaning into the emotion and wanting rather to move away from it. And that's conditioning because we're all born with full comfort with emotional expression. As a baby, we experienced our emotions freely. And if any of you have any little ones at home, you know this is true. Humans are inclined to emote and they want us to join them in their emotion. Unfortunately, though, we get conditioned away from leaning into the emotion, but also leaning into the emotions of others. Now, that conditioning has been influenced primarily, as we discussed, by historical and political events. The wars played a huge role in our moving away from emotion, particularly vulnerable emotions and anger. Research actually shows that leaning into the emotion supports its processing and more quickly than you think. So, our biggest obstacle for actually doing this kind of work will be our own biases against emotion, including our discomfort with emotion and our fear of making it worse. Teachers, in particular, are concerned that it's not their mandate or that it will create some huge emotional or behavioral problems. The best defense I have for you is that you need to see it to believe it. So, what can you validate? You can validate emotions and emotional states. You're sad, you're mad, you're ashamed, you're lonely. Attitudes. Yeah, I get there's no point. Or, yeah, I know you think he doesn't like you. Urges. I can understand why you might want to quit school. Behaviors. I get why you're acting like this in the classroom. Or silence. Understand how you might not want to talk to me. Once you have validated this way with three becauses, and you have brought the emotional elevator down from, in this picture, I think the 11th, with each because, 8th, 5th, 2nd, down to the main floor, you may or may not even need to move to step 2. So that's really important to underline. But remember this list because it's going to help guide you. And we talked about it a little bit earlier. If the child shows sadness, it calls for soothing comfort. If they show anger, it calls for feeling heard, creating space, setting boundaries. If they feel shame, it calls for reassurance. If the child is misbehaving, you'll need more practical support of setting limits. But there are other supports in place as well, such as redirecting for a young child, problem solving if there's a problem at the core of their emotional issue, or taking over if it's just beyond their ability level. It's important to keep in mind that you probably already have the second step down pat, and that sometimes it's not even necessary after the child is validated. So, for example, you're sitting with a student reading, maybe you're a resource teacher or you're working in a small group. And you say, yeah, no wonder you don't want to come to group or resource because I'm here to do this thing that's really hard for you. And that makes you feel bad inside, and so on and so on. That can be enough for a child to be ready to engage. They might be like, okay, let's go. In some instances, the child could benefit from a little bit of support, a little bit of comfort, a little bit of reassurance, a little bit of space, depending on what's going on for that child. Keeping in mind that space goes with anger, not sadness. That's another false programming we have, um, to give someone who is sad space. So you might say, don't worry, we'll take it slow. We'll let you choose the book you feel you're comfortable with, an easy book for today, and then we'll move forward. So some reassurance. The practical need can involve redirection or problem solving. So a child loses their calculator, let's say, and they're really upset because their dad gave them that calculator and they haven't lost anything. They lose everything, but they haven't lost this. And oh my gosh, I can imagine why you might be frustrated and worried. You lost your calculator. You love that calculator. Your dad gave it to you and you haven't lost it yet. And you feel like you lose so many things, but this was special to you and you're really upset that it's gone. I get that. But you're worried, you're disappointed, and that makes sense to me. So that's the validation part. But then you quickly follow with support. Do you know what? How about right now I lend you this calculator and we'll take a look together for that calculator in like 10 minutes when this is over. I'm sure we'll find it. That will be so much more effective than many of the other kind of more impulsive reactions that one might have in the moment, which might be like, just borrow this calculator. It's just a calculator. For kids, little things are big things. So we can join them in this way and highly increase their capacity for engagement. So even though I've used examples primarily so far with students, the same stance works with adults as well. That actually brings us to the next section on working with parents. So please notice what happens in your body and how you want to respond when you hear this next sentence. So really try to do it experientially. Take a deep breath. Just pay attention to what happens in your body and what your urges are. A parent approaches you and says, I'm really disappointed in your teaching methods. You're not helping my child work to his potential. Okay, what happens to you physically? Because these are important clues. Do you feel that tightening inside? You feel it in your gut? You might even feel like there's tension or tightening. If you're like me and many other people, your instinct, your impulse is to defend yourself. Like, what's the matter with me? What's the matter with you? Are you kidding me? Really defensive. Or maybe you have a heaviness and a discouragement, and your impulse is to say, like, I'm trying my best, and to feel sad about that. So I'm going to introduce you to Adele's translator. When a parent presents with hostility, defensiveness, or criticism, what you can imagine as that's the stiff, hard branches on the tree, hands down every single time, what's fueling that presentation is either fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, grief, or self-blame, or the softer, more malleable roots of the tree, so to speak. When a parent presents with anger and rejection, whether it be toward you, the child, other kids in the classroom, the whole system, the principal, the federal government, that presentation is fueled by fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, grief, or self-blame. When a parent comes to you and you're speaking to him about concerns about the child and they present with denial or avoidance, every time those responses are fueled by fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, grief, or self-blame. And finally, if you're working with parents who don't seem to set limits around behavior or homework, and to you, they don't seem to be doing their part, or that they're overprotective to the point where they might let them skip school if they're afraid or uncomfortable, without fail, every time, these rigid behaviors are fueled by fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, grief, or self-blame. And how we, the recipients of those more rigid surface behaviors, interpret the underlying drive will drastically change the response. So imagine this parent comes to you and says, you're a terrible teacher. You don't have enough experience. I can tell you're young and nice, but truly my kids need someone with just more knowledge and experience than you. If you can put that comment in the translator, you can hear the parent say, I'm terrified. I'm terrified because my child is struggling. And despite my best efforts, I have not been able to help them in a way that's working. And I'm really scared to leave this in your hands. Because if this doesn't work, then it's going to be my fault. And I can't handle that self-blame. It's just too crippling. And so this is why I'm acting this way toward you. And this is something I think I won't pretend to excel at. I continue to practice and try to improve by remembering to put a tuck in comments in the translator. But when I do, I have the absolute best outcomes. It really changes how the parents then respond, and it makes so that they're much more willing to collaborate. And you have that phone message, that angry parent, the anxious parent who's always wanting more. Can you do this? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you using this accommodation or that modification? Why doesn't my child have an iPad? Why don't all the kids have iPads? Why don't we have nurses in the schools? It's fear. It's fear. It's very often fear. And then the next four are equally and probably present, but the fear is strong. And so, and by no means do I want to equate parents to children, but I do want to try to remember what a child looks like who's going in for an immunization, who's already had one and knows. And so they're coming at it afraid. The child knows what to expect and they don't like it. They're afraid. So they're screaming and kicking and flailing around. But how do the staff respond? Do they take it personally? How do the parents respond? Do they feel attacked? Not likely. They respond with warmth and with kindness. And if they're really good, they'll also validate. Of course, you don't want to come back for this validation. You've been here before and it's scary and it doesn't feel good. I get that. You poor thing. It'll be over in a second, all done. That's the kind of model that we want to apply because it doesn't matter what age you are, your brain responds to emotion and to validation in the same way. All right, so let's do a couple practice items. A parent comes to you and criticizes your work. They blame you for their son's poor grades. They slip in that they think you're overpaid and, the whole summer's off thing. You should be doing more because you get the whole summer off. Now, think about which emotions might be driving the criticism, the blame, and the whole negativity of the statement. Is it fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, self blame, or grief? So, chances are it's shame and helplessness. When parents present in a harder way, more often than not, underneath that crust is the parent who blames himself or herself and can't tolerate that feeling. And so they wish to express it outwardly. Other blame is usually a mirror of self blame. But helplessness is often there too, especially if the parents are working two jobs or they feel the stress of having their kids in online schooling. Or prior to COVID, maybe they had multiple teams for multiple kids and they were busy and they're not able to create an environment where they have the capacity to support their children's learning. Or maybe they just don't have the educational background themselves to know how to support them. In this situation, more often than not, it will be shame driving that response and perhaps helplessness. And so you can respond in the very same way. Depending on how the parent presents, if they're presenting with anger, you would present with a little bit of force in terms of, I don't blame you for being upset. I can only imagine how frustrated you must feel because your child's getting bad grades. And maybe because you'd like to have them online learning, but your Wi-Fi just isn't strong enough to support all the kids in your house and your job. And I can imagine that you might be afraid too, moving into a bit of a softer emotion because you really want your kids to do well in life. So the goal there is to try and deflate that parent, bring them down in their emotional elevator. It makes them feel heard, and the experience of feeling heard also leads to a diffusion of those negative and maladaptive emotions. Okay, second bullet. And so, by the way, you need to practice to be able to do this. So if you're thinking to yourself, I don't think I could do this, I don't think this will work, I would say two things. One, try. Trying it honestly, giving it a shot can be self-reinforcing because then you'll see that was way quicker than what normally takes to get this kid or this parent back on task. And try at home on small emotions, trying your spouse maybe. But once you try it at school, you'll likely see that a conversation that might have taken 20 minutes before might take 5 now. So give yourself a chance to give this strategy a try. So that's one, just give it a shot. And two, use the script. I can imagine why you might feel blank because 3 times. Okay, so here's another one. A family comes to you stuck in their grief. Their daughter has a developmental disability. They tell you that they need the school to do more to support her growth. And let's say this developmental disability is moderate to severe. So you know this child will likely need support for the rest of her life. I've worked in group homes and schools dedicated to supporting students with developmental disabilities. So I've certainly encountered many of these parents. And grief is the fuel here. A parent who has a child with a developmental disability, whether it's intellectual disability or an autism spectrum disorder, is terrified about their child's future. So I've certainly encountered this, and this can be quite challenging. And so, to be honest, sometimes the parents are right and more needs to be done. But other times, we're doing all that we can. And so, it will be important to be able to recognize and validate the grief and the fear that the parent is carrying. So, I can understand why you'd want us to do more for your daughter. So, right, you don't always have to validate emotions, you can validate this desire. I can understand why you want us to do more for your daughter because depending on the situation. So from my own experience, I might say with a particular child in mind, because you're afraid her programming isn't moving along quickly enough and you see how other kids are learning and she's not keeping up. And how is she ever going to learn everything she needs to be independent at this rate of learning? Or if it were autism, I might venture to say, because you see how hard it is for him to make friends. And that's scary because you don't want him to be lonely. And you worry that if he doesn't learn it here, how is he ever going to learn to make friends? Makes sense to me that you want us to do more. When the external environment mirrors the internal environment, that is soothing. The validation is going to go a very, very long way. And then you might be able to see if there are other ways to support the family. If not, then you'll be able to tell them the truth of it. And they'll be in a better position to be able to accept the truth. But if there's something to be done, obviously you'll have a partner in them because they'll be there to collaborate with you because of the validation piece. So it takes practice. I know I've said it before, it takes practice to override your programming in terms of how to respond. And it will require you to believe that it is worth going against your impulse. And of course, your human desire to defend yourself against attack and criticism. So like I mentioned yesterday, teachers are highly stressed about negative interactions with parents. And so this is not something that is normally trained. So I hope that this training will be helpful to you in that sense, but also this domino effect is why I felt this was so important for teachers right now. If an educator can be attuned and responsive to the emotional needs of a parent, that parent experiences validation and it helps them soothe the flames of the amygdala and then access their reasoning and logic. So therefore, it helps them to be more responsive to their child, and that creates a domino effect. So it could be a 2-minute conversation in the hallway with that parent. Doesn't have to be a big deal. And that can change how things go in the evening for homework time. And when that happens, the child stressors decrease and positive emotion states increase in the child. And this has all been demonstrated in research that emotion coaching has this effect. So I think that's pretty fantastic. But what is just as good is that the impact on educators is demonstrated as well, with less burnout, higher job satisfaction, and reduced complaints. People in general want to feel heard, like you really get them, even if you can't give them what they want. And that's been demonstrated. So for example, in the medical environment, people who feel validated are less likely to sue a doctor for malpractice. So if they feel heard, they get what they need and they don't feel the need to escalate. Okay, so this is the last module of emotion-focused school support, and it's about knowing yourself. So a student is feeling vulnerable. He or she is tearful, rolls their eyes, and walks away. tells you they hate you, or tells you where to go using colorful language. Of those four options, which one will make you the most activated? Try to pick out which behavior or comment really prompts a reaction in you. A child is tearful, rolls their eyes, tells you they hate you, or tells you where to go using strong language. So, as a group, typically, we all come out with our own pre existing emotions. And so, some of you will think, tears, I can't handle the tears. I get panicked inside. I know myself, if I see the tears, that's it. You get what you want. Rolling eyes are something that other people can't tolerate. And actually, the colorful language for other people might be seen as extremely disrespectful, whereas for other people, it doesn't bother them at all. So people get quite surprised that there isn't just one response that consistently is found to be the most activating. Your history, your emotional state will have an impact on how you deal with issues and students. It'll have an impact on whether you approach certain emotional reactions or whether you avoid them. And when I talk about history, I mean the way you were raised around emotion. So it may be that anger was not allowed in your home, or maybe there was a lot of it. So that will make you more or less comfortable with displays of frustration or anger in the classroom or in a parent. Likewise, if crying was or vulnerability was not something that happened a lot in your family, then naturally you'll have an impulse for response when kids present in that way. You might want to attend to it because your own experience of not being attended to, or you might try to avoid it because it freaks you out, or you don't know how to deal with it because you don't have that experience. So now, thankfully, you do not need years of psychotherapy to resolve these issues. Knowing or owning your strengths and triggers can go a really long way. And one tiny little thing that you can do as a start that can have a really big impact is to seek support from a colleague who sees the child or parent in another light. So if you have a colleague really great with the tough behavioral kids, but you get squirmy when they're around, use that colleague for advice and support, and vice versa. Maybe that colleague struggles with the more teary-eyed kids. So really know your strengths to capitalize on them, and know your triggers so that you can be aware of them. That way you're less likely to act on them, and then seek support from others who don't share those same triggers. As an educator offering support, are you more of a kangaroo or a rhino? So kangaroos are quite accommodating, don't want their students to feel bad, and can sometimes go overboard in protecting them. Whereas a rhino educator uses more of the toughen them up approach and can sometimes end up in cycles of defiance with kids who are sensitive to threat or defiance. So identify, are you a kangaroo or a rhino? If you're a kangaroo, pair up with a rhino. They need you and you need them. And, awareness is half the battle. When it comes to emotions or response to emotions, are you more of a jellyfish that absorbs all of the emotions present and struggle to keep their own emotions in check? Or are you more of an ostrich, avoiding seeing, thinking, and dealing with emotions? This is about knowing what your tendency is, because awareness is the first step in improving emotional expression. So are you a jellyfish with a pouch, a rhino with his head in the sand, or maybe you're a kangaroo with tentacles? At school, know yourself and find someone who complements your weaknesses. With regard to offering support, we don't want too much control nor too much sympathy. We want just enough direction and support, allowing the child to take the lead when possible, like a dolphin. With regard to emotional responses, we don't want too much emotion nor too little. We want to emulate a St. Bernard, warmth and attention, but with calmness. So to close off, I want you to revisit that time when you were 12 that I made you think about at the beginning of the training. Remember what you looked like, who was your teacher, what was going on at that time in your life with your parents, with your friends. Recall the feeling you conjured up. Go back into that emotion now if you can. Maybe it was that feeling of being a loser, maybe it was something else. Bring yourself back to that emotion. There's no timeline on emotion, so it should be there. Now, instead of imagining what a parent or teacher said or would say, Try validating that emotion to yourself with the three becauses. Either validate that emotion from your perspective or by imagining an adult who's validating you in that manner. It makes sense that I felt, or it makes sense that you felt. And tell yourself three reasons why that was logical. Take a deep breath while you do this. Why did that make sense? Why would someone understand that? So I'll give you a minute to think and feel. Now imagine you or the trusted adult meets the need by providing emotional or practical support. If you felt sad in your experience, imagine you get a hug or you give yourself a hug. If you felt angry, imagine someone listens to you defend yourself without repercussion. If you felt ashamed, imagine someone reassures you and breathe through that experience until the emotion subsides and provides you with a small amount of healing. Let yourself have the emotion if it comes up. There are no timelines to emotion. It comes up like it just happened until it's processed and released. Now I want you to ask yourself, which did you prefer? Did you prefer the initial version of your first impulse, what you said and what you think an adult would have said to you? Or did you feel better on the second trial when you validated yourself and imagined someone validating you and supporting your emotional expression? I know my answer. Validating an emotion allows it to heal the wound and soften. And that's what we mean by emotion processing. It's not what happens to people, it's what happens next. It's how people respond, it's how hurt someone feels that helps the healing. Again, what was the purpose of this? Using emotion coaching in schools improves the classroom environment by supporting a return to learning without extensive intervention. 1 minute or less is the goal. It may open the door with more challenging children and parents. It has a domino effect that's likely to make the child feel more heard at home and therefore improve his behavior at school. They can increase staff confidence once you get some practice and has the potential for reducing stress and burnout. And finally, although we didn't talk about it a lot, it's meant to increase your awareness of your own triggers and seeing them as triggers as opposed to a reflection of the truth, which can reduce their impact on you professionally. I strongly invite you to try something out that you've learned today with a student or a parent, or perhaps with a colleague, because remember, these skills are not just for kids and parents, they're for human beings. I also should indicate that if any of you have training in the Ross Green model, this incorporates well into that model. And if you have behavior management training or CPI, it also fits well into those models as the de-escalation technique in CPI, but also in addressing the action phase of BMF. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to add them in the comments. I will try and moderate and see if there's any answers that I can give you. If you'd like more information, definitely please visit and go thank Dr. Adele Lafrance and her team at the mentalhealthfoundations.ca, where they provide free resources for people. Also emotionfocusedfamilytherapy.org, or you can visit my website, navatsatassociates.ca. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on notifications if you like this webinar. I will be posting others very similar to it, and I really appreciate your time.